We originally predicted Mark Carney's ascension first to replace Trudeau before the election, and then predicting that, given the full support of the infamously pliant Canadian media, would be a far more formidable opponent to the Conservatives and PP. I always have trouble pronouncing his last name, so I hope you don't mind. I'll pronounce it as PP. And at the time that we wrote that, of course, the Conservatives were plus 90% on Polymarket, favored to win the next election, and you couldn't even bet on Mark Carney as a contract. But having studied Canadian politics for several decades for a variety of personal and professional reasons, if you read the Canadian media close enough, it's actually quite transparent what's probably going to happen. And so while we certainly took some brand risk making that original call in a piece in the first week of December called Alberta Clipper, and then the follow-up piece in April where it was very clear that the fix was in, and then we elaborated on some further predictions, which I'm sure we can get into because they're also.
I feel lucky and I'm excited today because we have Doomberg back with us. This guy writes the most popular Substack, but almost a pioneer in making one so successful. If you're not familiar, they focus on energy, finance, the economy at large, of course, politics when it intercedes. I mean, there's a large thing there, and you can find him at doomberg.substack.com. But he's got he and his group have commodity industry backgrounds, and that's what first caught my eye, writing at a level that was sophisticated and yet gifted and able to convey difficult concepts. And as I say, I've always enjoyed reading his stuff. We subscribe here on Money Talks and enjoy getting the chance to chat with him. Doomberg, thanks so much.
Go on. Just kidding. Yeah. Mike, great to be back with you. I always enjoy our conversations. And, can't think of a more timely week to make a return appearance on your show, given the density of the news flow, let's say.
Well, I want to start with the Canadian election. And the reason is that we're going back sometime. You said, best what? Mark Carney's going to be your prime minister. You didn't wait till, later in the game to talk about that. But you wrote something special, I think it was April 16th, when you called it the fix. And I want to quote it. I'll get more clever later, but I don't want to change your words. And you said, to understand what's likely to transpire in the months ahead, we first discard the notion that people like Carney actually believe the things they say and write. One does not become head of the central bank of both Canada and England, nor chair the board of Brookfield Asset Management, nor the puppet choice for the elites that control Canada by being a maverick thinker with original ideas. Let's elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for reading that quote. It was a fun piece to write. We originally predicted Mark Carney's ascension first to replace Trudeau before the election, and then predicting that, given the full support of the infamously pliant Canadian media, would be a far more formidable opponent to the Conservatives and PP. I always have trouble pronouncing his last name, so I hope you don't mind. I'll pronounce it as PP. And at the time that we wrote that, of course, the Conservatives were plus 90% on Polymarket, favored to win the next election, and you couldn't even bet on Mark Carney as a contract. But having studied Canadian politics for several decades for a variety of personal and professional reasons, if you read the Canadian media close enough, it's actually quite transparent what's probably going to happen. And so while we certainly took some brand risk making that original call in a piece in the first week of December called Alberta Clipper, and then the follow-up piece in April where it was very clear that the fix was in, and then we elaborated on some further predictions, which I'm sure we can get into because they're also beginning to unfold. Our interest in all of this, of course, stems from the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin, one of the most important and largest hydrocarbon resource bases in the world, and the complex relationship between all of the provinces in Canada, both with each other and with Ottawa, plays into this, and the sort of the U.S. historical ties to Alberta, which few in the U.S. actually are aware of, and how Alberta became the Texas of Canada, except it's landlocked. And so it's really just a fascinating and interesting series of threads for us to pull on from that geopolitical energy lens, and having a little fun making some predictions that happen to come true never hurts.
Well, speaking of, does he believe what he says and believe what he writes? One of the puzzling things during, or confusing, let's call it, things during the election is, he sort of tries to have it all ways. that yes, we believe, when the Trump tariffs were announced in February, yes, we believe we got to lose our energy dependence on the U.S. We need to be able to, get the more oil to Tidewater, and people jumped in and said, oh, you're going to do pipelines. And he certainly indicated yes. Then literally within that week, he appeared, in Quebec on a talk show saying, oh, no, we'd never go over the head of the provincial government. Well, we know Quebec's never going to allow unless there's a major change. I mean, there has to be some negotiation, but Quebec's made it clear they don't want, coast-to-coast pipeline coming through their province. So, and he said since that we're going to have Indigenous say-so, the provincial say-so, all of that. Well, I don't know what to believe.
I don't think there's actually anything inconsistent with what he said when you consider our overarching prediction as to what's about to transpire. So it might be helpful for the listeners who have not read The Fix Is In that I summarize it briefly.
Yeah, please do.
It is our view that for reasons we don't understand, there has been a decision amongst the power brokers in Canada that Alberta's energy should be unlocked. And in order to do that, a constitutional crisis needs to be provoked. And as part of that constitutional crisis, the potential breakup of Canada will be amplified in the media. Trump is playing his part. I think he is a strong supporter of Mark Carney for reasons that go trace back to their time in New York City together when Mark Carney was the chair of Brookfield Asset Management, and Trump had various financial entanglements with that firm. But for whatever reason, and again, one need not know why a model works. You should only really focus on why a model works, or that a model works. Our view is that there will be a constitutional crisis, and what Quebec will get in exchange for allowing the cross-country pipeline to traverse their borders and maybe even, indulge in a bit of the flows for their own sort of quote-unquote domestic uses, is that they will finally settle the outstanding issues and cement Canada's constitution and, for the next 100 years, the question of Canada breaking up will be put to rest. And so there will be significant concessions given to Quebec, as there will be significant concessions given to Alberta, namely the freedom to create the infrastructure needed to unstick its energy with less interference from Ottawa. And in return, Canada will emerge from Orange Man bad, more unified than it ever has been, and a bigger player on the energy stage. And in fact, we think American energy dominance will soon become North American energy dominance. And I think that's an end state that all involved want. And Mark Carney, the reason why we were so sure that Carney would win as early as December was because he is the one, and one of the few, who can make this deal because he was so strident in his climate activism. So he's the one who can make the deal because I don't think he believes any of that nonsense. But he's the one who can win the election, not lose the support of the Liberal Party. And then once you get in office, well, gee, we have this constitutional crisis, so we have to sacrifice something. And we're not going to save the world anyway, so let's save the country. And I have to concede these points to both Quebec and to Alberta. And I think that's the grand bargain. And we're already seeing this play out, as we put out in a piece this morning, which you may have seen, called The Week That Was, where we highlighted several of our most recent calls. And Canada was sort of the middle portion of that piece. Trump is already talking about a trade deal between Canada and the U.S., which we predicted. Carney will get a very favorable trade deal from Trump to increase his political chops, just as he needs them to most, to navigate the country through this, what we believe to be a fake constitutional crisis that Danielle Smith, who we described in a previous piece as best actress in a drama, doing her bit, already talking about loosening the path to a separation referendum in Alberta. The pieces are all falling into place. Canada's not going to break apart. Canada will never become the 51st state. Alberta's not going to separate. What's going to happen is the net zero, the extreme aspects of the net zero agenda will be set aside, and Canada's constitution will be solidified. And Orange Man bad is a great lightning rod for, we have to do all of these things, otherwise Trump. So that's what we think is happening. And look, we could be wrong, but so far, so good on that front.
I can't remember a time when we've had this unprecedented sort of overhang of a U.S. presence in our electoral process. I think it would be fair to at least have an examination of whether, without the sort of rallying point of we hate Donald Trump, if the Liberals could have been this successful. I mean, they certainly played that card relentlessly till they got a sprained wrist. They played it so often.
I mean, I think this was all hatched at Mar-a-Lago when Trudeau famously went down there after Trump, threatened the tariffs in the first place. And you'll note that it was upon his departure from that meeting that the 51st state and Governor Trudeau talk began. And we predicted in a sort of intervening piece between the Fixes In and Alberta Clipper that once Carney became prime minister, all that talk would subside, and it largely has, except for one reference to it that Trump made, I believe, on election day itself in the hopes of further crushing the hopes of the conservatives. And you have to wonder, wait a minute, why is Trump actively supporting Carney? Well, there's one theory that states he has eyes in Alberta and breaking up Canada is on his agenda. I think that's all just feeding the necessary fear of a fake constitutional crisis to get the grand bargain that I described earlier done. And Trump will play his part.
I'm going to skip around a little bit because you've been doing a lot of different subjects. And this is, again, from your piece, what a week it was. And that's got to be the renewable energy crash the system crisis in Spain. Maybe elaborate a little bit more eloquently than I just did.
This is an example of a giant risk that many experts have been warning about for years. We first wrote about it in January of 2024, that because of the media's lack of interest in reporting on anything other than the sort of party line, is wildly underreported, not well known amongst the population. And that risk is as follows. The forced introduction of intermittent renewables onto a grid substantially reduces the grid's ability to withstand deviations in frequency that can cascade into grid collapses. Not to get too technical, but the primary reason this is because natural gas power plants and coal power plants and nuclear power plants, what do? They create heat, they boil water, they make steam, and they spin turbines. And those giant spinning turbines have a certain amount of inertia. And it takes a lot to get them to stop spinning. And when you have a grid that has a high degree of inertia, it can override little faults here and there that might otherwise cause complex cascading failures. And look, grids are classically nonlinear systems, sensitively dependent on initial conditions. You can impose the appearance of linearity on a complex system if you buffer it enough. We are removing the buffer when we shut down coal plants and replace them with solar panels because there's no spinning parts on a solar panel. And while wind turbines do spin, the way in which they connect to the grid doesn't impart that much in the way of inertia. So Spain, which just a week before the grid collapse was bragging about having run on 100% renewables for some certain small period of time, of course, some bizarre event. And by the way, when you're talking about chaotic systems undergoing destabilizations, the actual root cause is irrelevant. The original name for a piece that we conceived that we won't write was blaming the butterfly. The butterfly flapped its wings. That didn't cause the hurricane. What caused the hurricane was the system was susceptible to small deviations in initial conditions that then allowed such flapping to spread. We made reference to butterflies and hurricanes in this piece that we put out this morning. And by the way, for those listening who aren't paid subscribers to Doomberg, we made this particular piece free to all readers. And so if you want to get a sample of our work, you could head over and read that one that we put out this morning.
Well, as I say, I'm bouncing around a little bit, but that's to show the scope of the stuff that you guys do. That you cover these things. I mean, I think everybody followed your lead when we talked about the European energy crisis, for example, going back, whatever it was, 3 years, 4 years. You were the lead people explaining what was going on, but you focus also on China, Asia, Europe, North America, and you break up those kinds of things for different topics that are very relevant, both to the investment markets and to individuals. And let's face it, we've all felt that thing. And I got to give you props for this, so you won't remember. But I've been described as the biggest bull on copper without owning any. And that's largely because of Doomberg. And I loved your comment to us, which you said, yes, yes, yes to all those sort of stories that we're hearing, the narrative, and then it said, but where's the price movement? Where's the price reflecting this?
Right.
Which, of course, is the key point. And
right.
I've had a good laugh at my own expense several times thinking of that, but I'm not so sure oil doesn't fall in that category to some degree. And I know you've written, I thought, a great piece when you talked about, let's price oil in gold, let's price oil in dollars. And what are we really talking about here? Are we talking about oil as a product? Or are we really talking about declining currency, purchasing power of a currency?
Yeah, the thing that energy investors get excited about is the demand for energy in the short term is inelastic, which means whenever you have temporary shortages, you see these violent price spikes. And nothing seduces a gambler like the prospect of a potential price spike. But if you plot the price of oil in real terms, either in inflation-adjusted dollars or in ounces of gold, you can see that over a 50-year time frame, like the direction of travel for the price of energy in general is down. We have effectively an infinite supply of hydrocarbons. And when I say that, people sort of have their feathers ruffled a bit, but I say effectively is just as much work here as infinite. Like for purposes of modeling, we'll all be long dead before supply scarcity really matters. So in my mind, in the decades ahead, we don't need to worry about scarcity. And so what you have is the oil and gas companies are amazing technological wizards. They are deflationary machines, and the break-even cost of hydrocarbons keeps going lower. And in price takers markets, where you have an abundance of supply, the market price eventually equilibrates to the cost of capital and return needed for the marginal producer. And so you might see spikes in oil if a war breaks out in Iran, for example. But our view is it's far better to fade those spikes, because every spike is followed by a glut, than it is to try to time them. You'll just eat away your premium waiting for your call options to go up in value on the day you happen to be long out of the money calls and Iran's nuclear facilities get hit by Israel or something like that. When you see a super spike in energy, wait until it's off 20% from its highs and buy a put 6 months out at half the current price, and you will make money. Like, that's just, like, we don't give trading advice, but that's a far wiser thing to do than to sit around waiting for this decaying product to go up in price. We would sort of view it as going along the VIX every week, hoping for the stock market to get a little volatile. There's a reason why people sell that premium as opposed to buy it. And so oil today, like driving into the office, I see sub $3 a gallon gasoline in the US. And today's dollar is not the dollar that it was 20 years ago when the price of gasoline was $3 a gallon. In inflation-adjusted dollars, using 1984 money, the price of oil today is something like $20 a barrel. The technology embedded within the oil and gas companies is amazing. The break-even price for natural gas in the shale patch in Appalachia is something like $2.40 a million BTU, which is the energy equivalent price of $13 or $14 a barrel. The world is swimming in hydrocarbons. We know where to go get it. Peak cheap oil is a myth. But the seduction of the super spike has cost so many investors so much money over time. So just to finalize this point, today, 1 ounce of gold buys 50 barrels of oil and change. A Big Mac is 3 times the cost of a million BTUs of natural gas. Like, what are we talking about? Like, energy is cheap. The human endeavor relies on access to an abundance of cheap energy, and we will do what is necessary to find more than enough at a reasonable cost.
And coming back to President Trump, he's going to be happy with this. I mean, he needs to have oil, for energy, obviously for U.S. manufacturing at a much lower level. So you're not going to get any blowback from him.
Yeah, Mike, it's actually much more significant than that. One of the things we find interesting is Trump has made very clear throughout the campaign that he wanted to flood the world with energy. And an interesting aspect of this is that, many of our subscribers are in the oil and gas sector, and we would guess that 90% of the executives who subscribe to us are big Trump supporters. And we had been warning before the election, both in writing and on several podcast appearances like this, that Trump is bullish for supply, which is bearish for price and bearish for your equity. Like, you just need to be mindful that this is what's coming. And then he has delivered. Say what you will about Trump, and many people have lots of interesting things to say about him. He is trying to do precisely what he promised to do on the campaign trail. And one of the things he wants to do is, quote, unleash American energy dominance. Well, when you dominate supply, what does that do to price?
Yeah.
So we think a deal has been cut with the Saudis. We don't know what was given in return, but the fact that OPEC decided to accelerate production into the stock market crash that followed after quote unquote Liberation Day, we thought was very interesting. It made us sit up in our chair and we say, whoa, something has changed here. And as we said in the piece this morning, Trump wants $50 oil. And like we've said on other podcast appearances, like, we don't know who's buying oil at 62, but they don't like money because the US president wants $50 oil and he's going to get it. And so the initial announcement by OPEC knocked about $10 off the price of WTI down to about 60, 61, 62. It traded in the mid 50s briefly. It bounced back. It stabilized. Well, the Saudis came out and kicked the can again earlier this week, saying, yeah, we can withstand lower for longer. Does that sound like a producer who's trying to protect the market anymore? No, something has radically changed. Trump's going to get his way. Oil's going to 50.
And of course, that's great interest to Canadians too, as we've been alluding to Alberta and their financial future. But I'm also wondering, we're speaking of Trump, so I want to keep going with him and the tariff approach that he's taken, because you've written some interesting stuff on that. But it's related to the energy, related to renewables, related to electric vehicles rather. And that's also a huge overlay to what's going on economically around the world and geopolitically.
Yeah, and look, I think Trump is taking a big gamble, and we're not sure he's going to win. And we should say, like, we're not writing this from a pro-Trump stance. There are many aspects of Trump that we find rather uncouth. I think that the degrading of the institution of the presidency and some of the coarse language that he uses, and negotiation by social media post, are all things that we wouldn't necessarily prefer to see in a sitting U.S. president. But you have to give the man credit. He is a bundle of energy. He has enormous stamina. He does genuinely, I think, care about transforming the U.S. back into a manufacturing powerhouse. Whether that's possible is the question. And we have been receiving, from our industrial contacts since February, strong flags that we're heading into a major recession in the U.S. The biggest gamble that Trump is making is there's a timing mismatch between when companies can relocate in the U.S. to circumvent tariffs and when his political capital will expire. So if we head into a significant recession ahead of the midterms, and he suffers a significant loss in 2026, then it's over, right? He's not going to get much done. And he has significant political capital today, and he has the will, and he doesn't care about being reelected, which is important, because for all of his trolling about running for a third term, we don't actually believe that. He likes to troll a lot, again, which is something we wish we didn't see out of the sitting U.S. president. But there is a conscious risk that the die is being thrown. We are going to effectively do what Russia did when the U.S. and the Western powers cut them off from the globe. We're going to become self-sufficient. The U.S. is going to become self-sufficient. Maybe draw the circle around North America and include some friends in the Western Hemisphere. But the U.S. grows its own food. It produces its own energy. It used to make a lot of its own stuff, and there's no reason why it couldn't again. And that's Trump's agenda. So what we have now is a race against the clock. Can the U.S. cut enough trade deals in the sort of 90-day window that he has given himself? We would keep a close eye on Korea and Japan. I think they'll be the first to get over the line, but also we think Carney will get a deal done too, and that would be a big one. Obviously, the largest bilateral trade relationship on the planet. And then it ultimately becomes a war with China. Now, what we do think is that Trump has overestimated his hand when it comes to China.
Yeah.
We wrote a piece called Escalation Dominance where we talked about how it's not just how much pain you can inflict on your opponent, it's how much pain your opponent can withstand. And China runs a dictatorship and a surveillance state, and its population has a history of suffering a lot of pain, much more so than the US, which we think has become rather soft. But beyond that, if you look at the quote-unquote trade imbalance, Trump is focusing on the revenue. We would focus on both the profit and the criticality. So if you look at what China buys from the US today, it's soybeans, LNG, fertilizer, propane, right? These are things that they can mostly acquire from other sources. Yes, ships will be rerouted and friction costs will go up. But the US, in addition to acquiring cheap clothes and trinkets and all the garbage that we buy from China, we do in fact buy from China all manner of really sensitive, critical to supply chain materials for which China has a monopoly that we handed to them. We wrote a piece 2 years ago called Geopolitical Warfare, where we described how China's willingness to pollute meant that it was able to occupy monopoly positions at choke points, like rare earth metal processing, the production of magnesium, which is critical for the production of certain alloys that go into vehicle production and lightweighting. China, pick your favorite. Certain key rare elements that are critical for the production of semiconductors. China has a chokehold on it. All of the cobalt in the world effectively gets concentrated from, mining concentrated in the Congo to purified metal suitable for battery-grade materials. China owns 97% of the silicon ignite manufacturing and wafering. So they have this monopoly position. I was in industry when they operated in the way that they did to put us all out of business. I saw it, IP theft, predatory pricing, government support of local industries that then dump cheap product onto the market. All those things are true, but they've been true for 45 years. And you can't undo 45 years in 15 months. At least we don't think you can, and we'll find out. But that is the gambit that Trump is running for sure. And you can already begin to see a bit of a walk back from the brink because China is not playing ball. It's very similar to what happened in Ukraine. Like, why did we think we were going to win a kinetic war with Russia near Russia's supply chains and thousands of miles from ours, where ours are dependent on China, who is clearly on Russia's side in this war? It makes very little sense. And don't even get me started on Taiwan.
Well, I mean, there's so many things. I loved your law of anti-logic that basically summed up by saying, when it comes to a crossroad and there's a choice, we can count on our leaders to make the wrong one. And it was stung that was so simple, straightforward. Gee, if we cut off our nuclear in Germany and we then say no to German gas, we don't really know what to do next. Oh, you mean wind and solar is intermittent? It seemed like it was a shock to them. I mean, just as an example of some of the type of decision making that you've just alluded to, another one.
Yeah, and again, our view of the world, we like to characterize ourselves as lateral thinkers, which means we're not burdened by preconditions or preconceived notions, and we are unabashedly in pursuit of a model that explains the future. We don't even really need to know why a model works. What matters is the model works. And so when we got a hunch that Trump was going to torpedo the conservatives of Canada and throw his weight behind Carney all the way back in December, it would have been nice to know why, but we didn't need to know why. We just had that axiom as an assumption, and then you observe the news flow and measure it against that assumption and say, wait a minute, something is up here. And then by early December, we had seen enough that we took the risk of flagging that observation in our predictions and put it under our masthead. And look, we're in the content business. If we get things right, we make more money. And if we get things wrong, we lose more money. So every time we press send on a piece, we're taking business risk. Luckily, that one paid off.
And many others. I'll come back to China for a second, because it's fascinating, and you've written about this, but the Canadian government made a big, and so did the Democrats, a big investment in electronic vehicles, in EVs. And we've already had Northvolt seek bankruptcy protection. One of the big EV manufacturing battery plants that we put money behind. But I also look at it's a reminder of how far along, and you wrote about this, the actual technological sophistication is in China. That is it BYD,
Yeah.
Makes a car that's half as expensive as we can get here, which is hence the 100% tariffs, but superior to in many ways. And and the North American market just isn't, because as lots of talk about the tariffs and autos, but this is one thing that you've brought up, a couple of things that I find are fascinating when you look at the growth of the North American auto market. Who's buying them? Well, it hasn't really changed. It's the rest of the world that counts. There's just so many things I know I've thrown in together there, but
Sure.
that's certainly having an impact.
Yeah, let me unpack that a bit, maybe.
Yeah.
So first of all, and I'm going to speak rather bluntly, it is easy to leapfrog the competition when you steal everyone else's IP, select the best parts of it, and don't have to pay to reinvent it internally. And that's what China did in the auto sector. I mean, let's be honest, I was in it. I remember seeing the first BYD Frankenstein mobile, I think in 08 or 09 at a auto show in Shanghai, and it was an exact replica of the Toyota Corolla on the outside, like copy and paste.
Yeah.
And then it had a mismatch of other people's proprietary technology under the hood. You can't really, it's difficult to explain what an advantage it is to take 80 years of engineering from Ford and from Volkswagen and from GM and Audi and take the very best parts of it and just start from there. Then you mix in, artificially weak currency and access to abundant supplies of cheap thermal coal, and labor conditions that would cause many of us to be rather uncomfortable if our children were forced to work in such facilities, for example. But also, frankly, having competed against the Chinese, I'll tell you a story. This is an important story, a bit of a diversion. When we were in the solar market, it was clear what was going on, and a very famous sort of B2C customer that had very fancy, shiny booths at COP meetings and sustainability groups. Well, their procurement teams are different than their public affairs teams. And we made the point that, hey, this firm that has given you a bid that's well below our cost, they stole our technology. And also, by the way, it's hard to compete against a supplier whose concept of a water treatment plant is a pipeline to the river.
Yeah.
Like you talk about ESG and all of these things, and they're like, we're sorry, that's for the courts to figure out. And so we lost the business. We got out of the business. People got out of the business, and China controls the supply chains. And it's the very same thing is occurring in automotive. And one of the things that we pointed out in our piece called WrestleMania, thank you for referencing, the amount of passenger vehicles sold in the U.S. today is the same as it was in 1985. You cannot put high enough tariffs around Fortress North America and have companies who are capitalized to compete globally survive. And the rest of the world is going to want to buy a $14,000 BYD plug-in hybrid that goes 1,200 miles between refills and charges. And by the way, relatively well-appointed interiors. You can't get a car like that here, let alone for $14,000. But if you're Brazil, okay, maybe you're not going to have a domestic auto industry either, but at least your consumers are going to get dirt cheap cars. China has won that race. Ford, Volkswagen, GM are in significant trouble. Hulk Hogan's not walking through that door, even though he just spoke at the convention. But nonetheless, full credit to Trump for trying. If he's going to succeed, I think the dollar needs to get a lot weaker. There's going to be a recession. He's hoping for a V-shaped recession, powered by cheap energy. Back to our point earlier about $50 oil. Like there's a grand plan here. Low interest rates, dirt cheap oil, high tariffs, investment, sort of the U.S. calling a VIG on all of its protected citizens, kind of like the mafia. We'll see whether it works. It's a gamble. The risk is, of course, more than half, 90% of Washington doesn't want him to succeed. Just because there's an R inside the brackets behind somebody's name does not mean that they have Trump's interest in mind, especially in the Senate and some members of the House. And so he has taken a significant gamble. We'll see if he wins.
Well, and you look at the implications. You can get $50 oil, but it's not going to encourage the industry within the U.S. borders. Because he wants, he's big on returning to the strength of the, America first or whatever, is to get the engine going again.
I have a slightly different view. Look, the U.S. Oil and gas industry does not have a glorious track record in discipline, and they have a proven track record of willingness to incinerate shareholder value in return for volume. Our friend Porter Stansberry tells us a joke, which I think is instructive, that captures the essence of the lack of discipline in the oil and gas sector. A driller has died and is trying to get into heaven, and they reach the gates and they find out that heaven has too many oil drillers in it. And so this entrepreneur, this wise old oil driller cups his mouth and screams at the top of his lungs, "Oil found in hell." And all of the oil drillers dive out of heaven, chasing the incremental barrel, making room for him to enter. And oil found in hell is the type of phrase that sticks with you over time. Look what happened when the Saudis last declared a price war in 2014, 2015. Yes, the equity got wiped out in the shale patch, but those drillers kept on drilling. They went into bankruptcy. The debt holders owned the company, and they recapitalized, and they came out and drilled just as much as they did before. And I think if we were betting, we would see something similar to that, and Trump kind of knows it. And by the way, there's going to be a trade. Hey, predominantly the biggest beneficiaries will be big oil, because we're pretty cynical. What'll happen is this. You'll get all your permits, and you'll get access to all these federal lands for 20 years. And we'll term out the refilling of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve so you can hedge your production now at a good profit, and we'll refill the SPR over time. And the big players will buy up all the small players who are struggling. Then they'll wait for a Democratic administration, and they'll print money again. And so we like to say that oil and gas companies build during Republican administrations, and they make money during Democratic administrations, and that's what's played out historically. So again, back to our earlier point, 95% of oil and gas executives voted for Trump, and now they're mad at him because he doesn't want their number to go up. I mean, I don't know what you were expecting. He wants $50 oil. Yeah, he's going to get it.
If you could, just to finish off, seriously, you've had a wonderful run, track record of seeing things. And in our case, we're talking about Prime Minister Carney, and you're writing about him being Prime Minister before he had won the Liberal, Party nomination. This was in December. And so I want to just say, can you pick two or three things that are on your radar about what's coming, that you're maybe doing some work on right now, and you're saying, I'm keeping an eye on these variables to see, you have maybe not have published it, or maybe you have, but just what we can sort of give a heads up to our audience.
Yeah, I think there's again, we're not confident enough in this thesis that we're willing to write about it. Because, when you put it under your masthead to 300,000 subscribers, you better be sure, but to speculate with all the caveats is fine. There's a grand bargain that we believe is occurring behind the scenes, which might explain Trump's position on Ukraine, Saudi's willingness to bring oil prices down, the noise around Iran, and even the China tariff war. And I think the grand bargain is Russia is given the maneuvering space to secure a military victory in the 4 regions. Iran denuclearizes, and Russia is responsible for implementing, the transition from a mixed objective nuclear program to a purely civilian energy program in Iran. And even a grand solution to China-Taiwan is cut in a way that China makes room for U.S. manufacturing renaissance, and in return, a détente plus is achieved between China and Taiwan. I think that's Trump's grand vision, and in that world, the U.S. need not spend as much on its military as it's currently doing, and the military-industrial complex gets to indulge in Europe's extra spending in order to make up the difference, and peace and prosperity for all, comes out. By the way, maybe we're biased. We would very much like to see such an outcome. Of course, if you're in Ukraine, and my comments about Russia imposing a military solution aren't going to be received as a desirable outcome. I'm speaking more about not going to war with Iran and not going to war with China. Ukraine is its own special disaster for which historians will have harsh things to say about the Biden administration. But the other parts of the deal are ones that we think are incredibly valuable. Trump knows that NATO was defeated in Ukraine and there's not much he can do and he doesn't have leverage. I think securing a nuclear-free Iran and de-escalating with China ahead of the midterms is probably high on his agenda. That's the grand bargain that we see on the board, but not quite sure enough in the thesis to put pen to paper on it just yet.
Well, that's why people have to subscribe. They have to go to Doomberg, .substack.com, the biggest success story. And it's been a successful platform. It's really changing things. But Doomberg is the most successful writers on that for good reason, as you can hear the depth of their knowledge, their global perspective, and their track record. All of that comes true. And I so much appreciate, Doomberg, you finding time to share it with our audience. And you know me, I'm already going to put you on the spot. I look forward to chatting again in the near future.
Yeah, you bet. And look, Mike, I'll just last comment. Look, all of our revenue comes from our subscribers. We accept no sponsorships and we don't associate with any brands. And so whatever you read from us is our authentic beliefs. We don't invest in what we write in. So we're not talking our book. So every subscriber is precious to Doomberg. You can find all our work at Doomberg.com. Mike, always great to talk to you. Looking forward to the next time because I know between now and then, fascinating things are going to evolve.
Great stuff. Thank you.